Hi everyone, welcome to the Governance Update from VLGA Connect, brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. And a pleasure as always to welcome Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff at the VLGA. Hi Steve.
Hi, Chris, and you know the pleasure's mine. But yeah, thank you. And it's been another big week in governance.
It sure has. We seem to say that every week lately. And we're going to spend some time with a guest very, very shortly to catch up on some of those things that are happening in the sector from a state government perspective, if you like. But what's been exercising your mind this week in the main?
Oh, look, a few things, Chris. Actually, can I start with the mea culpa?
Yeah, sure.
The thing that exercised my mind is that those Sydney mayors managed to get an audience with the Premier.
So they did.
So the topic of successfully engaging with other levels of government has been exercising my mind about what are some good things to do and what are some things that maybe you shouldn't.
So for those who might not have caught up with that, as we talked last week, the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, was refusing to meet with a group of 12 local mayors in the COVID-19 hotspots. There was continued angst, if you like, about that decision in the media, and I think it might have got a little bit too much for the Premier, so she relented, met with them in small groups, Steve, not the whole group, which is probably sensible. And not only that, but as of when we're recording this, there's a meeting happening with regional mayors and GMs around New South Wales with the Deputy Premier about the same issues. So some good engagement ultimately happening there. So what do you think those meetings, how do you think those meetings are going? What would a good meeting look like?
Well, a good meeting, I think, is one where, and you will have some suggestions here too, I think a good meeting is one where the participants spend as much time thinking about what are the strategic objectives of the other side as they do thinking about their own strategic objectives. So you can come to an outcome, no matter what, that will enable you to work with government, going into the future, I suppose.
Yeah, and putting that politics aside, because I suspect there's political party lines that are coming into play with some of these discussions as well, which aren't always helpful.
No, I think that's right, Chris. And I think in that sense, that notion of, doing the work in advance, with the council officers and the ministers or department staff before mayors, councillors meet with the elected, whether it's ministers typically, is always really important because you can't go into those meetings blind, having just, demanded a meeting, I suppose.
Good to see. And an interesting exercise too, Steve, to have a look at some of the statements that have come out from the mayors that had the meeting with the Premier. Most of them very appreciative, very conciliatory language almost. It's some of the media reports that get into some of the detail about how heated apparently the discussion got with one of those groups of mayors, which, as I understand it, came about when talking about how communities were feeling stigmatized and treated differently to others, and that apparently brought some heat into the conversations.
I think that's right, though, Chris, isn't it? And often local government will be in a position where they're going to state government typically, advocating strongly for a local community, whereas state government might be looking at a matter more broadly. So, and those particular mayors would feel that their communities have been stigmatised and the communities will be expecting them to advocate hard. I guess that means that no matter what's been said in the meeting, it's still possible to play nicely in the media and use language that sort of indicates there was a robust discussion.
Absolutely. And we do note there's been some easing of restrictions, particularly the curfew being lifted since those discussions happened in some of those LGAs in New South Wales. There's plenty online about those reports if people want to dig into that a little bit deeper. We've got a few other things to talk about, Steve, but we might just put that on hold because we do have a guest waiting in the waiting room.
Can you hear someone coming, Chris?
I can hear someone coming, and it's Lucy Dalton, who's joining us from Local Government Victoria right now. And a pleasure to have you with us, Lucy Dalton, Director of Policy and Strategy, Acting Director, I should say, at LGV. How are you finding the role?
Thanks so much, Chris, for having me. It's fantastic. It's really good. I've only been in the role for about 6 weeks and certainly had its challenges with childcare not being accessible at the moment, but it's such a fast-moving space. There's a lot that local government is involved in, and it's super interesting. Yeah, thrilled to be here.
Very true. It is an interesting time. So thank you for your time to just touch on a couple of things that are of interest to the sector at the moment. I know you and Steve have had a bit of a chat about how the culture review's going to roll out. Steve, what do you think is the key message we'd like people to hear from Lucy today about that?
Oh, I think we just start at the very good beginning, Chris, and I'm really interested to hear from Lucy. Perhaps what might have do you think might have been the prompt for the minister to initiate the review and some of the drivers of the process so far?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Look, as I said, I've been in the role for about 6 weeks, and it's already incredibly clear to me that this particular minister is very focused on the culture of councils. He recognises that there are challenges when you bring together a different cohort of people every 4 years who may not know each other and might all have opposing views on things, to actually make sure that they function well as a group and deliver the best governance for their local community. So it's a real priority of his. Like he said publicly a number of times, he doesn't want to dismiss councils. He doesn't want the state government to have to intervene at that level. And so the genesis of this project is really just to dive into some of the things that we probably already know, but doing that real sort of literature review, the deep dive of what we know already, and pulling that together into a discussion paper that can actually frame some solutions going forward.
So, Lucy, the people that are running this process, there's some pretty heavy hitters in the academic world, aren't they? So that to me has sent a pretty strong signal that the minister's very serious about this being substantial and robust in its evidence base and thinking.
Absolutely. So the review is being, the lead project team for the review is PricewaterhouseCoopers. They've got 2 eminent academics involved, Graham Sansom from the University of Technology, Sydney, and Anona Armstrong from Victoria University, who both specialise in different areas. So I think Graham would be well known to the sector. He's been involved across the country in terms of reviewing local government legislation. Really knows what he's talking about. And Anona has a really strong focus on that kind of governance and ethics, and how boards in particular work together. So hopefully the combination of their skills, I think, will bring us some real insights and some real tangible next steps.
Has that been a theme, do you think, Lucy, that notion? I've heard the minister talk about it before, about how local government really started as roads boards and acting like a board, and perhaps we've drifted away from that?
I think so. I think the way I've heard the minister talk about it is, it's not the same as Parliament. We can't treat councillors in the same way as we would treat or expect parliamentarians to behave, who have the full support of things like party discipline and slow way in which, Parliament operates in a very particular way all of the time and consistently, whereas the amount of change that can happen at a council election, where you could be up with, a set of 10 new councillors, none of whom have ever been councillors before, you don't experience that in Parliament. And so, yeah, I think that the view is that they probably should be considered more like a board. Which, of course, they're not exactly that either. So it's a challenge. But yeah, there's a bit of that history for sure.
Yeah, and it's a really good point you make about councils sort of being more transactional and not getting the luxury of 3 readings in 2 separate houses. And yeah.
So, Lucy, in terms of the way the sector is expected to engage with this process, how do you see that playing out for councils and councillors for that matter?
Yeah, so I think really key message is everyone will get an opportunity to provide input. That's just going to happen in a variety of different ways. So at the moment, the project team is focused on that sort of literature review. There's been a number of reports over the last couple of years from VLGA and other integrity bodies that paint a pretty clear picture of some of the problems in the sector at the moment. So they're drawing from that material, as well as working with some of the peak organisations, including the VLGA, over the next couple of weeks to really frame up that discussion paper. The goal is for that to be released early next year for broad sector comment. So, yeah, that's the plan.
And Lucy, we talk a bit about sort of the, what do you call it, the salacious stuff, you know, the conflict and so on. Where else might councillors and council officers be thinking in terms of responding to this review?
Yeah, what I would really like to see from the sector is some of the kind of good news stories. And here are the examples of where we do it well, because there's no solution to this. We're going to change the legislation and then everyone is going to behave in a really respectful manner to each other all of the time, and it's not going to be a problem. It's going to be an ongoing dynamic, particularly as I said, you know, you've got changes to who's sitting on a council every 4 years, and so you're going to have to reset and reframe things. So what I would love to see is advice from the sector about things that are already happening on the ground in councils that have kind of tried to address this sort of stuff already.
Lucy, might that include the way councils, perhaps some have more successfully prepared new councillors for the role and the responsibilities that they take on? Because it seems to me that's the heart of some of the issues. And I know we've had the mandatory training and that's gone some way towards clarifying that, but clearly more is needed. So do you think there's an opportunity here for people to demonstrate how that has worked in some places?
Absolutely. I think I've been sitting in on the GAC, the Gender Equality and Advisory Committee. They've had 2 meetings, I think, since I've been in this role. Actually, it's just 1 meeting. I've sat in on 1 meeting of the GAC since I started in this role. And it's really clear from there that the role of what a councillor actually is and the responsibilities of councillors isn't necessarily very well understood by candidates as they enter into the process. And so that can be quite challenging for mayors and CEOs to really make sure that the council is working as a cohesive unit with that long-term strategic outlook for their local communities. And so absolutely where councils have got programs or initiatives in place to really set that scene well at the start of a council term, we'd love to hear more about that through this process.
So I'm thinking about the Strathbogie situation where the acting minister has just recently appointed a municipal monitor there at the request of that council, I understand. And I wonder whether it's one of those examples of a council that's identified they do need help with understanding roles and responsibilities that could, you know, ultimately feed into this review as a bit of best practice.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, monitors in the past, as I understand it, as I said, new to the sector, haven't really been used in this way. They've sort of been reserved for where governance has broken down in a council. And I don't think you would say that about Strathbogie. But I do think it's a really good example of this minister being incredibly interested in making sure that councils are set up to succeed, and that he doesn't have to intervene and dismiss it, a council later on in the process. And that's a similar approach he's taking with South Gippsland as well, sort of proactively announcing a monitor there to really reassure candidates going through that process now that there will be that support and that guidance when that council's first established.
Now, just to clarify, Lucy, on South Gippsland, so there hasn't been an appointment at South Gippsland announced yet. Do you have any sense of what the timetable for that appointment would be?
Yeah, so we're just working through that at the moment, but the goal is to have a monitor on board ready for that first meeting of council.
Excellent. Thank you for that bit of clarity. We'll watch that one with interest. And Steve and I discussed last week on the program, we sensed or guessed that it's this proactive approach that's being taken, which I think, you know, is another signal alongside the cultural review of the approach that this minister in particular is taking to the sector, which is not going unnoticed. The other thing I'm mindful of, Lucy, in your role is we've still got some of the elements of the new Local Government Act being implemented. How is that tracking from your perspective? I know it's only 6 weeks in the role, but how's it looking to you?
Yeah, look, can I just say, I think councils have done an amazing amount of work in the last 2 years to have, the biggest reforms to the local government legislation in 30 years happening at the same time as a global pandemic, where councils are on the front lines very much in emergency response as well as economic recovery. I think the sector's done an amazing power of work to get to where we are. We are hearing from the sector that there are some challenges coming up to the last few documents that need to be resolved as part of implementation. Julie Reid, the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria, recently sent an email to CEOs just clarifying that unfortunately we have no power under the Act to extend the deadlines. But I guess the key message for the sector is really that part of the reforms and part of the benefits of this new Act is that councils have more control over these plans and processes going forward. So it may be that coming into the end of the year, they've got some very foundational documents. I know workforce plans in particular are an area where councils are best practice is a really significant amount of work, but the foundational requirements under the legislation are not essentially best practice. So I think councils should be well on track to deliver what they need to under the legislation within the timeframes this year. But then the Act obviously gives the opportunity for them to revisit things and re-engage or do as they need in the spirit of continuous improvement at the local level.
That's a really good point. I was wondering whether the workforce plan might have been the key one you were thinking about there in terms of those challenges, because of course council plans, I think a lot have got them in place, but by the end of next month, they certainly need to. But you make a really good point. Just because you've got to have it in place by December doesn't mean you can't then review and
absolutely
update.
Yeah.
And the asset plan is probably the other really big one, which is midway through next year. Are you getting a sense that that's also an issue, or is it a bit too early to say?
Look, we're not hearing much on that one yet, but recognise that again, there's probably quite a spectrum of what an asset plan might look like from that kind of foundational aspect all the way through to a best practice plan, and different councils will be at different stages along that journey. So recognise that one's going to be a big one as well.
Well, Lucy, that's been great to get those insights from you. Well done. First appearance on the governance update. I know Steve can be scary, but I reckon you've done pretty well today. Will you come back?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And absolutely, I'll be back. Cheers.
Terrific. Thanks, Lucy.
I think that was a useful conversation, Steve, to get some insight into those things from Lucy. And how about that for a first appearance on the program? She did very well.
Very, very impressive, Chris. And some good information to think about, particularly in terms of that cultural review and what participants might like to start thinking about beyond the sort of salacious stuff.
All right, a few things to get through before we wrap up. I know for some reason you perhaps will shed some light. You've been exercising your mind about what councillors or candidates in elections need to do if they get an anonymous donation. Does this really happen?
Chris, let's be very clear that we are a particularly apolitical broadcast here, and we certainly don't get into politics. You can imagine that, from time to time, an elected person might receive money in a brown paper bag or in a suitcase, or heaven forbid, from a blind trust. And so it did exercise my mind as to what would happen if a councillor received an anonymous donation.
And what would you do in that case, Steve? Surely there's a process for this.
Who knew? And in fact, I had an idea there was a process, but Tony Rounich at Hunt & Hunt actually drew my attention to a rather excellent document published by Local Government Victoria called a Conflict of Interest Guide. And let me just check it. In the public interest, a Conflict of Interest Guide for councillors, delegated committee members and council staff from October 2020. Which goes into all sorts of information around management of conflict of interest. The particular part that's important is on page 22, Chris.
And what does that say, Steve?
Well, Chris, it says that councillors are prohibited from accepting gifts over the threshold unless they know the name and address of the person making the gift. So what is not, or what might be ambiguous at other levels of government, is in fact quite clear in local government, and a failure to comply can lead to a prosecution, a fine of 60 penalty units, which is about $10,000, potentially costs, and repayment of the value of the gift. The other bit that's really interesting, Chris, is it says that if the councillor doesn't know who gave the gift, and this is in the Act as well, that what they can avoid prosecution by handing the gift over to the councillor and making the appropriate declaration within 30 days. And then there's a conversation for the council in terms of what it might do with that gift.
Is this something you think happens often? Because exercising my mind is, why would you give somebody something anonymously? Because you would think the purpose is to try and get some sort of quid pro quo benefit from it.
Oh, Chris, you're heading down a real slippery slope there. Did you say anonymously or purportedly anonymously? I'm not quite sure. But I think you're right. Normally speaking, you know, the giver of the gift is trying to seek some kind of influence. So that's true. But anyway, for some reason, the drafters of legislation have felt the need to think through this and to have a process. Chris, the thing I wanted to come to was that there is a body in the state of Victoria, or a person in the state of Victoria, called the Registrar of Unclaimed Monies, who sits within the State Revenue Office. Now, complex processes, but basically, and there's a whole grab bag of things that might be quite rightly remitted to the Registrar of Unclaimed Monies. But most importantly, if the unclaimed monies continue to be unclaimed for a period of time, that money goes off to consolidated revenue for the state. So, however, I kind of like the idea that if money turned up in a brown paper bag and it was handed in by the councillor, that's the place it should go, because then no one could say that the community benefited, and you know, it's not encouraged. But that isn't specified in the legislation.
Okay, good points there. This, of course, reminds me that we're right in that period in the month of September when personal interest returns are due. And I know the Inspectorate's been sharing some advice and guidelines around that.
Lovely segue, Chris. And I know you and your fellow administrators and councillors and officers across the state, of course, are all alert to the fact that the personal interest returns are to be completed in the months of March and September. And you, like I, saw the tweet from the Inspectorate, which pointed to some guidance material on the Engage Victoria website for anyone that's got any queries on that.
Indeed. Now, a couple of congratulatory notes, Steve. Peter Bean from Melton City Council has been appointed this week as the new CEO at Kingston. Yeah,
terrific operator, Peter Bean, and congratulations to him and to Kingston. I was really pleased to see that appointment. So, good luck to Peter.
Same here. Peter's been in his GM role at Melton for over 11 years. And when you look at his local government career, about 6 or 7 councils going back quite some time, so very experienced operator going to Kingston. Their win, I think, is probably Melton's loss. And the other one of note is the Australasian Management Challenge, which is run every year through Local Government Professionals Australia. The trophy's coming to Victoria because Maroondah City Council has won that challenge this year.
Highly contested, that particular award, Chris, and congratulations. I think they called themselves the Realm team at Maroondah.
The Realm Collective, they did indeed. The runner-up was Otago Regional Council in New Zealand, showing that it truly is an Australasian event, and third place went to Randwick in New South Wales. So congratulations to all those groups.
Well, sort of hot on the heels of another Bledisloe Cup, Chris, it was nice that we could get one over the Kiwis occasionally.
Yes, absolutely. The what Cup? What is that? What did you call it? The
Bledisloe Cup, the trophy between Australia and New Zealand in rugby union.
Rugby union.
And there's a rule that apparently they just always win it.
I have actually heard that. I'm playing dumb, but I have heard that. Steve, Fast Track is coming up. Now, is there any truth to the rumour that some people are holding back because they didn't see the original version of this program?
We did hear a report to that effect, Chris. I was just reminded that it's a bit like some of those movies, Godfather 2, Toy Story, where you don't have to have seen the original to watch the sequel. In fact, I'd go to my particular favourite, Kill Bill 2.
So is this a case of where the sequel actually will eclipse the original?
I think... Now, I'm going to take a bit of a risk here. Stay with me, Chris. This may well end up on the cutting room floor. I think one of the attractions for anyone who's into Tarantino and Kill Bill 2 is that the caravan scene really stands up and makes the movie worth watching, and any one of our panels could be the caravan scene.
Yes, okay.
Can I go into a discussion as to why?
Please do. I must declare, I haven't seen Kill Bill 2. I've seen the original.
I think actually you need to go to the start. And if this metaphor is going to be a bit of a long bow, but look to the title as do the actions of Beatrix Kiddo have an honourable intent? Because the movie is called Kill Bill, not, help Bill to reflect and see how Bill can lead a better life. In which case, it might have been directed by Ron Howard, not Quentin Tarantino. The caravan scene happens in an enclosed space, a caravan, which you could treat as a metaphor for a council chamber. Like, there are a limited number of characters in a compressed space, which means there's a lot of action.
Yes.
Strangely, Chris, there's a suitcase with a whole lot of money.
Right, yeah.
There's a character called Bud, played by Michael Madsen, who is driven by greed and avarice, and that greed and avarice goes nowhere good.
I can't see how any of this could be of relevance to local government, but keep going.
There's a snake in the grass, or a snake somewhere, and that doesn't actually help. There's another character called Ellie Driver, who... let's just say Ellie's field of vision isn't as broad as it might be. She's a bit sort of narrowly focused, and that doesn't play well for Ellie longer term, because Ellie and Beatrix Kiddo don't practice, how would I say this, restorative conflict resolution techniques, Chris.
Right. Yes.
It's a particularly messy environment. What prevails is the person who has, resourcefulness, innovation, and resilience, and ultimately the impacts play further outside. I should actually say one really downside of this is that Uma Thurman actually suffered some workplace safety injuries as a consequence of this film, and the inability to provide a safe workplace actually played out badly for the producers of the film and was quite expensive over a number of years. So there are a bunch of metaphors, and I reckon I've raised some themes that every one of our fabulous 3 panels will follow up in some way or another, but maybe without the theatricality.
Yes, so there's the storyline for Fast Track 2, which is coming up on the 1st of October. We've got a few people booked in, but there's still some places, correct?
There are some places. Chris, it's going to be an online event. I've spoken with 2 of the panels this week, as you know, got the next panel next week. I guess the point I want to make, this is absolutely pertinent to where councils are at the moment, sort of 12 months into their term, and we're looking forward to a really good day. So for officers, encourage your councillors to come along. For councillors, check your diaries and clear them out.
All right, VLGA.org.au/events to find out more and register for that. And while you're there, why not book yourself in for the live panel next week on Thursday, the 23rd, on electing the mayor, what leadership requires. That's going to be a great discussion.
You've got a cracking panel for that day too, Chris.
We sure have. And I've got together with this panel earlier this week to do a bit of preparatory discussion. Kim O'Keefe, the mayor of Greater Shepparton, who, as we all know, has been doing an amazing job, lots of media, lots of community messaging through the COVID crisis that gripped Greater Shepparton for some weeks. Ian McCormack, an international author and speaker from Canada who's researched the attributes of effective civic leadership. He's a great speaker. Looking forward to having him as part of it. And of course, our friend Tony Rownick from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, a former mayor himself. And he'll sort of put in context what the mayoral role has looked like under the new Local Government Act with some of those changed conditions, if I can call it that. So that's next Thursday.
That'll be terrific, Chris. Yeah, really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Steve. We'll wrap it up there for another governance update. Great to speak as always. Have a good weekend and we'll talk next week.
Thanks, Chris. You too.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff of the VLGA. And that's the governance update for this week, with our thanks to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. And thank you to you for tuning in. See you soon.